All right, I hit the broadcast button.
So we're going?
We're going. Just give me a minute, though. I need to grab the link and everything.
Sure.
Copy link. All right, I just tweeted it out, so just give it a couple beats. The stream to update or to go live. So, yeah, just give it a couple beats and we'll be good to go.
Okay. All right. We are live. It's me, the NASCAR expert. I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. Welcome to the April 2nd, 2017 NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Giffen at RotoDoc, an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a two-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. Nick, how are you doing on this Sunday morning?
I'm doing great. I'm feeling really good. I've got the RotoViz hoodie on, of course. There's some cat hair on it because my cat slept on the RotoViz hoodie last night, but that's okay. Back with the Budweiser this week. I think it's the good luck charm. The Black Butte Porter didn't quite work out last week with that poorly timed caution for when Greg Galding wrecked and killed all my lineups with Chase Elliott in them. So yeah, that's how it goes. But we're gonna have a good week here this week. I feel really confident about my picks this week.
You're doing the black RotoViz hoodie. I thought that red was kind of your default RotoViz hoodie.
Yeah, the red one is in the wash right now, so I'm going to have to clearly wash the black one with the cat hair. It's just like an alternating thing. Yeah, just one of those things.
Yeah, the black one, I think, is like the Darth Maul version of the RotoViz hoodie.
Oh, I like it. I think I'm going to have to...
Anyway, so all right, let's get going here. There isn't too much to update. Daniel Suarez has moved to the back of the field, which I don't know if that's going to affect anything anyway, but why don't you tell us if that's something that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Daniel Suarez moving to the back of the field. He had to go to a backup car because of a crash in practice. He was going to start 19th. He still starts 19th for DraftKings scoring purposes, but obviously starting in the back now. He wasn't to play anyway. I already had him listed as a fade in my article, even before the backup car news and everything, or moving to the back. He just was really slow in practice. He didn't look good at all. So, Daniel Suarez, not a play for me this week. Matt, I think I'm hearing me through your speakers or something.
I don't know. Everything sounds good on my end.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can definitely hear myself. Oh, well.
That might just be one of those things you have to play through, like an injury.
Yeah.
You just have to play through it.
Might have to.
Just grind through. Okay, so before we get to all the Twitter questions, I need to remind everyone, of course, that you can get a 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass through our NASCAR podcast homepage, rotoviz.com/NASCAR podcast. With that pass, you get unlimited access to all of Nick's premium NASCAR content, and your subscription supports the pod. Also, don't forget about Nick's NASCAR courses at Roto Academy. One of them is a video course with JM to Win of Roto Grinders, and you can find those at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Okay, Nick, let's talk about Martinsville, and let's get to the Twitter questions. The Twitter questions, you can ask those at hashtag RVLive, so keep those coming throughout the show. So the first question we have, let's see here. Yeah, so one is, who's an underrated driver no one's talking about who has a chance to be in the winning lineup?
So my favorite underrated driver, which means he will no longer be underrated if I say this. No, I'm just kidding. I think my favorite underrated driver is Ryan Newman this week. So Ryan Newman has won here in the past. He won in 2012 at Martinsville. He was really quick in final practice. I'm trying to find the stats here. Here we go. He was... sixth in the 10-lap average, 5 in the single lap right there. So Ryan Newman definitely has a fast car. He starts 11th, so he's in that awkward starting spot where nobody's going to play him most likely. But he's priced down at $7,400, which is too cheap for him, especially with as good as he is at these flat tracks lately. I mean, he won at Phoenix. He was very strong there. And, I know he kind of air quote lucked his way into a win, but he had to put himself in a position to win. He was in the top, 12, 8, 10, the whole race basically after he moved up from his 21st starting position and got himself a chance to be in that, late pit stop, or not take a late pit stop, not take tires and get out front and win the race. So he's got a very fast car at Martinsville this week, 7,400 underpriced, starts 11th. I think if he can pull off a top 5, he could be in that winning lineup because that's 6th place differential points, 39 points for finishing position. That gives him 45 points down at 7,400. That's surely going to be enough to get him in the winning lineup, especially if he grabs a handful of fastest laps.
So one thing you mentioned was putting himself in position to get lucky at the end to win a race. And obviously some of that has to do with strategy and crew chief situations and things like that. So kind of going off scripture, but a question for Martinsville in particular, how much does strategy come into play for this race?
How much does tire strategy come into play for this race? I think it's going to be maybe a little different than Phoenix, of course. NASCAR did bring in that softer tire, but Rodney Childers, who's Kevin Harvick's crew chief, he's not there this weekend. He's suspended, so he's actually tweeting from home, his couch. But he said that tires were not wearing as much, which I thought was weird. I think it's probably because of the aero changes to the car, even though they did bring a softer tire on one side. But he also said that they were laying down more rubber. So I was a little confused by how they could lay down more rubber, but not wear as much. So I'm not really sure what to make of tire strategy this week because of the new aero, because of the new right side tires. Does that bring in more randomness? Maybe, but if they aren't wearing as much as everybody expected, that means maybe we could see a full run, a full segment on just one set of tires if it somehow stays green. Now, obviously, that's a tall order to ask at Martinsville. You get a lot of wheel hop and things like that. But certainly, I think if we can get a full green flag run, people probably won't be coming in a pit, it sounds like, because the tires aren't wearing as much as maybe people would have thought going into the weekend.
All right, next question. There are a lot of options for cash games today. Who are the two drivers you wouldn't want to pair together in the same lineup?
Who don't I want to pair together in the same lineup? That's an interesting question. I guess maybe it would be for cash games. I guess maybe it would be something like just too many drivers starting way too far forward. So my two most likely dominators are Kyle Busch and Joey Logano. I like them. I like pairing them in cash games because I think that gives you the best shot at getting a bunch of those laps led. So maybe putting in one of those secondary dominators with either of those two guys or both of those two guys is something I don't like. Maybe whether that's a Keselowski, a Truex, a Harvick, or one of those drivers starting in the top 10 that I didn't name in terms of being Logano or Kyle Busch. I think I probably wouldn't want to put three of them together. I think people will certainly go with Kyle Larson in cash games. There will be a faction of people that do that. I'm not on that train. Kyle Larson's crew chief said that they're about a 5th to 7th place car, they think, and they're about half a tenth of a second per lap off. So they definitely need to make up some ground. This isn't Kyle Larson's best track. He fully admits it, even though he did finish 3rd in this race last year. So I'd probably avoid Kyle Larson in cash games. If I were, making a cash game lineup, which I am, I don't have him in my cash game lineup currently.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question. Why are you higher on Harvick than Keselowski when Keselowski seems to have a faster car and is cheaper? Thank you.
Not sure where I said I'm higher on Harvick than Keselowski, but I'm higher on Keselowski than Harvick. So
all right,
there you go. Yeah. So if I said that somewhere, then maybe it was on the podcast, I think earlier in the week before we got practice times and different things like that. It could have been that. But now I'm higher on Keselowski. Better practice times, just as good, if not better, track history here. Keselowski has been one of the strongest drivers over the short-term Martinsville history that we like to talk about. So I'm much higher on Keselowski than Harvick this week. I have I wouldn't say a ton of Keselowski. I have some Keselowski, and I have very, very little Harvick. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's just practice. Just practice.
Right. So you talked about Larson a little bit. How high do you think Larson is in the $4? And if you are scripting 150 lineups, is 10 to 15% ownership too low on him?
I don't think that's too low. I think that's great. I think he'll probably be in the $4. I think he might be a little higher than at the higher stakes. I think the sharps will probably be a little more off him this week. Whereas, he was more owned in the high stakes last week at Auto Club, which is a better track for him. But I think the sharps will be more off of him this week, maybe 25% to 30% in the higher stakes and maybe above 30% in the lower stakes. Those are, again, just best guesses. And I think 10 to 15% on Kyle Larson is totally fine. I think that's right around the line with what I'm at on him.
Mm-hmm. All right. With 38 drivers, should I just do the math and use your formula to come up with a cash lineup points threshold? The answer is yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, so this week
But
there are.
go through that. Yeah, go through how
Yeah,
to do the
exactly.
calculation.
So this week there are only 38 drivers starting. Normally we've had 40 or 39. NASCAR didn't quite fill the field this week. There's no Derek Cope, thank God. Derek Cope should never be racing in NASCAR in the top series. It's just terrible. But anyway, rant aside. So we've got 38 starting places. That means we have 940 points for finishing position. And then we can add to it 375 dominator points. It gives us 1315 points. Martinsville is like halfway random, I would say. So my R squared on this is about 0.5 on my out of sample model. Phoenix was 0.65, so I'd say that's much on the more predictable side, and there's others that are less predictable. So I'd say take that 1315 and multiply it by maybe about 0.24, and that's what you get. So we're looking at like 315 for a cash threshold, I would think. It also depends on who dominates. If the chalky drivers end up dominating, the cash threshold is going to be higher than 315. If there's more randomness than we expect, the cash threshold to be lower than 315, but 315 is a ballpark average of what I would give if we ran this race 100 times.
Mm-hmm. Now, I like this next question. So I usually use one cash lineup for other sports. I'm new to NASCAR. What is your thinking here? And so obviously, I think there are two ways to think about this. One, this could be slate specific. What are you thinking particularly for this course, for this track and given the pricing? Then secondly, what are your thoughts kind of in general for NASCAR when it comes to cash games and how you want to sort of diversify your exposures?
Yeah, I think it for me, it's a little bit slate, track specific, and not even necessarily track specific, but sometimes just slate specific. Like if weird things happen in qualifying, like for example, this week we had a rain out, right? Or last week we had Logano and Johnson not qualify. I will tend to, if there's a lot of different chalky options, I might play 2 or 3 different cash lineups, and then in weeks where there's maybe not as much value, I think it pigeonholes us into more of one cash lineup. So that's how I tend to look at it. I usually play 1. Sometimes I play 3, and I don't have a set formula for when I play 3. A lot of it's just feel based. I feel like I have this feeling that I should play 3 because I want to have a little bit of hedging going on, because I think there's maybe just certain elements about a race or a slate or the way salaries are set up or something that I want to get exposure to different drivers, or maybe I'm hedging off of my GPP stuff. So if you're just not worried about GPP hedging or anything like that, if you're just playing, I would usually play 1 cash lineup. Occasionally I'll play 3.
Mm-hmm. Do you like Clint today? I'm assuming they're talking about Clint Boyer, not Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, no, I don't think we're talking Clint Eastwood, but I don't dislike Clint today. I find it hard to get a lot of exposure to him because he starts 8th, but he does have a decent car in practice. He was inside the top 10 in fast laps, in 10-lap average. This is me stalling to try to find what that number is. It was 9th in the 10-lap average, but 1st in the single lap. So definitely he has a strong car this week. So I think for Clint Boyer, I like him. He's just very hard to trust in that he's starting 8th. He's priced 8,000. You really need him to get a top 5 finish, at least probably to be in that winning lineup. So I have a very small amount of exposure to Clint Boyer. I don't hate him. I just think he doesn't have as much upside as you would like, obviously, in GPPs where you want upside.
So, this is a question that comes up, or questions like that come up every RV live show. And so guys who start anywhere from like 5th to 10th or something like that, people will ask kind of like, how high are you on this driver? Like kind of what are his chances of dominating? Can you talk a little bit, just kind of like historically big picture? Obviously stuff like this differs according to the track, but like what are the odds of someone who's not starting in the first 4 cars or first 5 cars, but starting in the top 10, but in the back half of the top 10? What are the odds of someone like that actually doing fairly well in terms of dominating?
Yeah, it all depends on who the driver is and what happened in qualifying. Obviously, in this week, we really didn't have qualifying. So somebody like Kyle Busch starts 10th. He's my number 1 pick to be a dominator, even though he starts 10th, because he has the best car this week. He's really good at Martinsville, especially recently. He dominated the race last year. I think one of the races last year, he led like 70% of the laps. It depends on the driver and on the starting position and all what we see in in practice, different things like that. So, I think just in general, if it's not a guy that we really think is a huge dominator, maybe somebody like a Clint Boyer that we're talking about here, for example, or Jamie McMurray in sixth, I think, the strong thing to do is to be pretty underweight on him because, not underweight necessarily, but have low exposure to them. Maybe the rest of the field has low exposure to them too, but have low exposure to them. If you think they can dominate, if you think they can get inside the top three, I think it's totally fine to have some exposure to him. And I think Jamie McMurray, as I just mentioned, is one of those drivers this week. He's starting sixth, $8,100, second quick and 10-lap average. Martinsville is also a very good track for him. He almost won that year that Jeff Gordon won in Jeff Gordon's final win, I should say. Jamie McMurray is another one of those drivers like Clint Boyer this week that I think has a very good car. I think McMurray's car is even better than Boyer's, so I have more exposure to McMurray than I have to Boyer, just because I think there is a chance he could end up being a dominator for part of the race, right? If he leads 15, 20% of this race, I mean, let's say he leads 80 laps, that's 20 points for a driver at $8,100. That's huge. So Jamie McMurray is definitely a driver I want some exposure to this week. Just don't go nuts on him. Obviously, you mentioned that 5th to 10th 12th starting position is very tough. And we've got three of those mid-price drivers there in McMurray, Boyer, and Ryan Newman in that 5 to 12 range this week.
Mm-hmm. All right. So next guy we talked about on the pod, and just a reminder to everyone, the pod comes out on Friday night or Saturday morning. And so it's before we record it before all the practices have finished normally. So how high are you on Chris Buescher?
I think Chris Buescher's a decent play this week. I think a lot of people will be on Cole Witt, who's 5,100, and Chris Buescher's 5,200. And the reason everybody's going to be on Cole Witt is because he practiced 15th best in final practice in the 10-lap average. I think it was 15. It was right ballpark in there. And Cole Witt, was also good in the single lap. Yeah, it was 15 single lap, 15 10 lap. So for Cole Witt, so I think a lot of people will be on him. I think Buescher makes a great pivot off of Cole Witt. I don't know how much we can necessarily trust Witt. I mean, he's been good at Martinsville. He's had finishes of 18th, 20th, and 22nd. But, what is the trustworthiness factor there? I think the probability that things happen to him, whether it's a car problem, just maybe not having as good a car as they thought or in practice, or other people improving it better over the course of the race, means there's some probability that Cole Witt won't do well, and I think Chris Buescher makes an incredibly good pivot off of Cole Witt onto Chris Buescher in GPPs, because I think Cole Witt will be the higher owned, and I think the probability that one or the other of them end up in the winning lineup is probably pretty similar. So in that case, I'm just going to play the leverage game there and just try to leverage off of Witt with some Chris Buescher. So definitely like Buescher this week. I also like Witt. I obviously, if he's a good play, and I have exposure to him, but I'm heavier on Buescher than I am on Witt, and that's mostly just the theory play.
Now, also, with Witt being more of a back marker car, like what do you think is the difference between Buescher and Witt in terms of equipment, and then what that might mean in terms of problems that they could encounter in the race? So
before this year, I would have answered, with Chris Buescher in this JTG Doherty car, teammate to AJ Allmendinger, who we've seen at times run up front, not like dominating, but certainly run inside the top 15, even occasionally top 10. I would have said Buescher clearly has the equipment edge. But for whatever reason, it seems like JTG Doherty with the addition of Buescher, and I don't know if it's because of the addition of Buescher or something else, maybe getting a handle in the aero package or whatever, they haven't been as strong this year. And I don't know if that's an equipment thing. I don't know if it's a bad luck thing. But certainly Buescher has not looked very good this year. Allmendinger's had his moments of looking good, but he hasn't finished races very well. So other than the Daytona 500. So, I think there's maybe a slight nod to Buescher in the equipment angle right now, but I don't think it's as big as I would have said before this year.
Interesting. How far back is too far for a potential dominator to start this week at a difficult to pass track like Martinsville?
That's a good question, actually. I really like that question. I don't think it's impossible for a dominator to come from the back, just given the nature of Martinsville. A lot of cautions, a lot of different pit strategies that can go on throughout the race. Do I take tires? Do I not take tires? Do I stay out? And then add the segments in, and we could certainly see some shuffling going on. So I don't think it's impossible for somebody like Matt Kenseth to to stay out when everybody else pits because he's qualified 20 or didn't qualify, right, and starts 25th, and then hop out front and lead some of this race. So I don't think it's impossible for it to be Matt Kenseth in 25th. That said, what is the most likely furthest back starting position? I'd say Kyle Busch probably in 10th. Maybe Jimmy Johnson starting. I think it's 17th this week. Jimmy Johnson starting back there has a chance to dominate, but his car hasn't looked that strong. So I'm not as inclined to think he would be a dominator this week. So yeah, he does start 17th. I guess there's potential there. Maybe potential for Denny Hamlin in 12th. I think that's probably as far back as I'd go. But the furthest back I feel comfortable with is Kyle Busch in 10th.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you just mentioned there Hamlin, and then I think you also mentioned Kenseth. Which one of those do you prefer in a GPP?
Say that again? It kind of cut out.
Hamlin or Kenseth, who do you prefer in a GPP?
Hamlin or Kenseth? Who do I prefer in a GPP? I think I prefer. God, that's a tough one. You know what? Normally I would say Kenseth, no brainer, starting 25th versus Hamlin starting 12th. But I have this weird feeling a lot of people are going to be on Kenseth. I'm underweight on Kenseth this week. I like him. I don't think he's a terrible play by any means, but I just think he's going to be more chalky than he showed in practice. More chalky in ownership than I think car strength that he showed in practice. So I'm definitely favoring, I think, Hamlin just on theory. Although, he doesn't have as much upside starting 12th versus Kenseth in 25th. So it's tough because I don't think we're really comparing apples to apples here with different starting positions. But if I'm going to gun to my head I'm going to pick Hamlin just because I think Kenseth's going to be over-owned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a really interesting question. Stenhouse, poor track history, but good in practice this week. And the narrative of getting engaged, if that's a thing. Is he a trap this week or is he a good pick?
Who?
Ricky Stenhouse.
Oh, right. Yeah, I love Stenhouse this week. I think he's a great play. So contrary to what I said earlier on the podcast, he doesn't have a good track history here. I was thinking of Bristol. I confused my half-mile ovals. But so he has a terrible track history here, but he was so strong in practice. I mean, he had, I think it was the 6th best 10-lap average in final practice. He had just a really strong car in final practice, and I think that is something we should take note of. People are going to be off of him for that track history. People are going to be off of him for his poor performances here. I don't know about this engagement narrative. I guess narrative. We can always walk down narrative street if we want, but I'm just going to go with that 7th best 10-lap average in final practice.
But it was fueled by his like newfound happiness with being engaged.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see. I don't think Stenhouse is a terrible play this week by any means. I like him, just in general, just because I think that track history is going to keep his ownership down a bit.
Okay, so here's kind of stepping out of it. Here's a question about narratives, because I think there's a difference between some of the more subjective things that you'll look at in terms of kind of like crew chiefs talking about their cars or drivers talking about their cars, and then other narratives. But what are the subjective things that you give credence to in terms of NASCAR, and then the kind of subjective narrative type of things that you don't really think about too much?
That's a good question. So one of the subjective things, of course, is garage talk, Twitter talk. Rodney Childers always tries to give his opinion on things. I just tweeted about how Kyle Larson's crew chief said they feel they have a 5th to 7th place car. Usually that stuff isn't lying or sandbagging most of the time. Occasionally there's times, but much more trustworthy than something like Coach Speak in NFL, I think. That said, that's one of the subjective things. The other subjective things I might give credence to are, it's tough. I guess I don't think there's too many other subjective things. For me, the way I play a lot in GPPs is just playing theory, ownership percentages, and probabilities, and so that's the heaviest part of my play. Any other subjective stuff? It's usually garage talk. Is there subjective stuff I don't give credence to? I guess I don't know what it would be though. This driver is starting in the back. That means we shouldn't play him. I guess I don't know. I don't think that's stuff I necessarily give credence to. Just because somebody goes to the back, you shouldn't play him. But
let's say
not a good answer here.
Let's say a guy returning to his not his home track, but home state or stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a little bit of extra motivation there. I certainly think that's something that you can't discount. Like Clint Boyer does perform usually pretty well at Kansas, not always, but usually he can perform pretty well at Kansas, especially when he has good equipment. So, you might give him a slight bump for subjectivity there. I think that's totally fair.
Or let's say, okay, but so two things. One, something like that might actually pop up in course history, or track history and be able to be quantified. But second, like, let's say something like Tony Stewart last year, like, okay, it's his last year of racing. He's going to be extra motivated, or like, this is his last race that counts for something.
Okay. I see what you're saying. So actually, I wouldn't give credence to that. Tony Stewart is going to drive as good as Tony Stewart can anytime he's in the car. I think that is stuff I don't give credence to now. One thing I do give credence to that is completely subjective is, especially early in the season, is, we now have a new low downforce package or a lower downforce package. This will benefit certain drivers more than others, right? That's something that is subjective based off what we think we know about the driver. This driver likes a loose race car, or this driver, has this feature about him that makes him handle this new type of setup better. That stuff is subjective. I do give credence to that a bit, just because I think it is true. Obviously, certain drivers come from different backgrounds, and I certainly believe that is something that's usable. One thing that's subjective this week that I am using, that I actually wrote about in my article, is Eric Almirola, and I don't know if it's subjective. It's objectively true that the way he drives into the corner is different than the way Marcus Ambrose, who used to be his teammate there, drives into the corner. Ambrose was very hard on the brakes, aggressive, attacked the corner, whereas Almirola likes to roll the corner, which means he's softer on his brakes. So the subjective angle isn't that how he drives, but the subjective is he'll probably less likely encounter brake problems because of his driving style. I don't know if I can prove that with numbers or statistics or anything like that, but it certainly seems intuitively like it makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Who are the top guys to use in the $7,000 range, or is that area just one to avoid?
So I've got three. Obviously, Ryan Newman, we talked about kind of towards the top of the show as my underrated guy. I don't think he's my top guy, of course, because he starts so far forward. More like a low-owned play that I think has some good upside despite his 11th starting position. The other two I like are Eric Almirola, who I just talked about, specifically because he can roll that corner, avoid using his brakes. He starts 19th. He had a very good 10-lap average. He's got a strong track history here. I think he finished fourth once here. This is one of his best tracks, so I like Eric Almirola. And then Austin Dillon. Austin Dillon's at 7K. I think he's just underpriced. He starts back there in the mid-20s. I think that's pretty good right there for Austin Dillon to be able to use him at 7K.
All right. When you're looking at 10, 15, and 20 lap averages, what exactly are you looking for?
So with 10 lap averages, I'm basically just looking for, where do they rank in 10 lap average? And I also look at when in the session did that occur. Now with Martinsville, it's a little all over the place. I don't think we can necessarily use when in the session that occurred here, but I think at other tracks where it either gets hotter throughout the day or maybe they made the run on old tires or something like that, I'll also look for when it happened, because if you're like the first driver to put up a 10 lap average later in the session, even though you might be like 16th on the 10 lap average charts, that might mean you actually have one of the stronger cars just because you did it in a time of day where you couldn't put as fast a speed on the track just because of temperature conditions or tire conditions or whatever.
All right. Brad Keselowski or Joey Logano in cash?
Joey Logano for me. I certainly think Brad Keselowski is a nice play in GPPs, though, for potential dominator.
All right. Thoughts on Austin Dillon for cash, especially if he lets you fit in Allmendinger and Kenseth?
That's totally fine to use Austin Dillon in cash. I might actually even have him in my current cash lineup. So totally okay.
I don't know if this is a fair question, but this person asked, and so I'm going to ask, which driver do you have the most exposure to in GPPs?
I'm not going to give away who I have the most exposure to, but I think you can infer from which drivers I like so far, and which are the chalkiest of the ones I like. You can probably infer some reasonable assumptions about my ownership percentages, but it's definitely a chalky pick.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's a question, kind of stepping out of this particular slate and race and just thinking kind of more holistically. What is the upper bounds in terms of ownership percentage for GPPs that you tend to have?
Very, very slate specific. Depends on how much I like a driver. Depends on how confident I am that day. Depends on what I think the rest of the field is going to do. It could vary anywhere from 1 week, maybe the most being 40-45%, which I think I did for Atlanta or something like that, to all the way up to 75-80% if I feel really good about a driver. So I will say the driver I have the most exposure to is over 50% this week.
Mm-hmm. All right. This person was asking, how should I be determining my driver exposures this week?
How should you be determining them? I always start
that's phrased awkwardly. How should you determine? Yeah. How should you?
So I always start with what is the probability this driver is in the winning lineup. That's where I go for my base, exposure core, and then from there I will tweak things based off of what I think the rest of the industry is going to do. If I think the rest of the industry is going to be overweight on a driver, I might go slightly underweight if I feel good about going underweight on that driver. Like, for example, this week, Larson, I feel good about going underweight on him. I did last week, too. Didn't work out. This time, I think I feel good about it again. So I try to figure out what is the probability this driver is going to be in a winning lineup. Now, how do you do that? A lot of it's intuition. I do some statistics on the side that I try to calculate what the probability is. But a lot of it can just be intuition, right? Like you got A.J. Allmendinger starting back there in 30th. He's practiced in the mid-teens, I think, in 10-lap average. Martinsville's historically been a good track for him. He probably has a 40%, 30% maybe, I would say 30% to 40% chance of being in the winning lineup, somewhere in that 30 to 40% range. So maybe that's where you want to start your base exposure to him and then adjust based off what you think the field is going to do. So maybe it's even higher than that. I don't know. It could be 50% chance that he's in the winning lineup. But I actually didn't calculate that this week. I've kind of this week been going off of my gut instinct. So obviously using my numbers and stuff, but I didn't put numbers to the probabilities that somebody's going to be in the winning lineup. So Allmendinger is an example that I'm using. Maybe he's 40% to be in the winning lineup. You think he's going to be 30% owned? I'm just throwing numbers out there. I think he'll probably be higher than that. But then you might want to go 50% on him if you think he's a pretty safe play given his track history. So that's kind of how I do it, and I do that with each driver.
Yeah, and then I think a big aspect of this has to do with risk tolerance too, and what your goals are. So let's assume that you do want to be overweight on a driver. Then the big thing is to what degree do you want to be overweight? How confident are you in that driver? And then how confident are you in your bankroll management and your roster
risk tolerance is huge. Yeah. Risk tolerance is huge. I obviously have a higher risk tolerance than most people. That's why I tend to lose more weeks than I win. But when I win big because I like taking risky picks. I like that's just my style. That's my mindset. That's the way I think about things. Is where can I get the most leverage? And when I'm getting the most leverage, it usually means that I'm doing what most of the people aren't doing, and because what most of the people are doing is following what will probably happen, but what probably happened doesn't always happen. So, I take small losses here and there, and then I get a couple big wins, and that usually works out in the end. Now, that's not for everyone. That's why I started doing my picks with different risk level tiers this week, because I realized, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, you seems like you lose every week. Well, yeah, I guess I have, although I've been close to winning every single week this year. So, I think making my picks in risk tiers, I think that's a much better strategy for giving advice, because that lets people know which ones are less risky. And then there's the second component of risk is how overweight or underweight do you go? Obviously, if you pick a player that's low risk, but you still go extremely overweight or extremely underweight, that also can increase your risk, even though the driver might actually be a less risky play. In NASCAR, it's risky to go 100% on anybody, period, in NASCAR. If you go 100% on the safest driver, that's still risky.
Yeah. Kind of a side question to this, but I think it's important. So you start the process by thinking about what are the percentage chances that this driver ends up in the winning lineup? How is it that you have reached that as your starting point, as opposed to some other, I don't want to say arbitrary performance measure, but as opposed to what are the chances that this driver hits sort of X number of points or something like that?
Yeah, I used to, when we first started NASCAR DFS, I did look at that X value type thing, but what I came to realize is with the way dominators work, you can't really assign X values to dominators because the leaders can hit 15 value, and that's great. But that means you probably need less value from your cheaper guys. But some weeks, dominator points will be more spread out, so there's a different X value you need to target. It's not like other sports where, especially like let's say NBA, where you want to hit at least 6x value to cash in on a DraftKings GPP, most likely. That most weeks or most slates tends to be where you need to be, especially in the larger slates. So I think that's a little different than NASCAR, where the dominator points really stretch and compress things depending on the number of laps in a race and how predictable a race is.
Mm-hmm. All right. Are you fading or underweight on Hamlin, Harvick, and Jimmy Johnson in GPPs?
Hamlin, Harvick, Jimmy Johnson. So I am with Harvick. I'm underweight, definitely. I think people will be using him. I don't think he'll be that highly owned though. I think he might be 20% tops, 15%, somewhere in there. But I'll still be even less than that, I think. They certainly were taking big swings at it overnight. When I say that, I mean their setup was way off in final practice. They're making large changes to their car overnight, hoping that they can find something that works. So they're certainly not happy with their car. I'll be underweight on Harvick. Jimmy Johnson, I'm probably going to be equal weight to the field. I think it'll be a pretty popular play starting back there in 17th. The fact he didn't get to qualify, 9-time Martinsville winner. So I think it'll be pretty popular. His price tag at $10,600, you want him to dominate a portion of the race. You want him to get some fastest laps. I just don't know what the probability of that is this week with his practice times not being off the charts. That said, he is Jimmy Johnson at Martinsville, so I don't want to be too different from the field there. I'm probably going to be equal weight. And then the last one was Hamlin. I think I'm going to be maybe equal weight on Hamlin as well. He starts 12th. He hasn't shown that he's the fastest car this weekend. So, again, another driver, you're going to want him to at least finish in the top 3 or 5, given that he's 9,700 this week. Price jump for him because of his track history. You also want him to get some dominator points as well, if that's going to be the case. So I might be slightly underweight on Hamlin. I actually don't love all 3 of those drivers. Not that I think they're bad play. I think Harvick's a bad play, but I think I don't think Johnson and Hamlin are bad plays. I just don't love them this week because I think their dominator potential is reduced, especially given their price.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a good question, I think. Is there any manufacturer or team who just hasn't found the answer at the paperclip and should be faded?
Is there any manufacturer or team that hasn't found an answer at the paperclip and should be faded? I don't think there's one specific manufacturer or necessarily anything like that. I mean, we have seen Jamie McMurray practice really fast. We've seen Kyle Busch practice really fast. We've seen Joey Logano practice really fast. That's a Chevy, a Toyota, and a Ford. So I don't think it's a manufacturer thing. As far as maybe a team, I guess as a whole, Joe Gibbs Racing hasn't been as fast as we normally would see them, other than Kyle Busch. But certainly Hamlin hasn't been where we would want him to be for his track history. Daniel Suarez doesn't have a handle on the track at all. And Matt Kenseth, I don't think he even ran a 10-lap average. That's how not good his car was. And his single lap speed was mediocre. So I think if there's a team we want to fade, maybe it's Joe Gibbs Racing, but I don't think that includes Kyle Busch.
Okay. Which driver do you think has the highest percentage to be in the winning lineup in GPPs?
That's going to kind of give away my ownership percentage, isn't it? Yeah. I think there's a handful of drivers. So in no particular order, I'm just going to go from the back of the field to the front of the field. I think possibly, Cole Whitter, Chris Buescher, AJ Allmendinger. I think you can't rule out Kenseth. I don't know if that's the highest probability. I mentioned Stenhouse. I mentioned Austin Dillon. I mentioned Almirola. I don't think Ryan Newman has the highest possibility, even though I like him. I think Jimmy Johnson, there's probability there. Kyle Busch, Joey Logano, Brad Keselowski. I think those are probably all the ones that are the highest, kind of going from the back to the front.
Now, kind of stepping aside, asking a question about the models. If someone wanted to try to answer that question for themselves using the models, how would you recommend that they approach the models and start to do research for themselves? Sure.
So my model is an average model. It takes all the different possible outcomes and averages them together. So it's going to be higher on Kenseth than I am, for example, because Kenseth starts 25th. Even though it knows Kenseth had a slow final practice, it can only make adjustments incrementally. It doesn't take huge swings at it because that's not what statistical models do. You don't want them to overfit. So it still thinks Kenseth has a very good chance based off of his track history. So this might be one place where I go away from the model knowing Kenseth hasn't looked very good. Maybe it's a more subjective thing. Yeah, there's data to back it up, but also just in general, he hasn't looked good. He hasn't seemed confident in his race car. I might be lower on Kenseth than my model. But in general, my model will get you a good chunk of the way there, 50% of the way there this week if the R-squared is 0.5. And then there's another 0.5 that's completely, totally random, right? So, I think the model is good. It's reliable. It's certainly one of, if not the best in the industry. But especially given the science and the machine learning methods that go into it that are super highly accurate. But it won't get you all the way there. So the model will get you as a good basis of where to start in terms of probability of being in the winning lineup. And the way I would do that is not just look at the raw points, but raw points maybe relative to salary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you already talked about Cole Witt. You are absolutely in love with him. Not absolutely in love with him, but you like him. Which cheap driver do you have, not most exposure to, but which cheap driver do you like? I guess like outside of Witt and Buescher, because you've mentioned those two guys.
Witt and Buescher, I think, are the only two drivers I have under 6K. I did talk about David Reagan on the podcast because this is normally a good track for him. Normally a solid track for him, especially with his starting position. But he just hasn't been very fast. I think it's possible to play David Reagan at 6K. But I don't think that's maybe the best play. I think I also mentioned Buescher on the podcast as my Joe Dirt cheap driver. So I'm basically sticking with Buescher and Witt under 6K. I think an argument could be made for Greg Galding. So Greg Galding is at 5,000 and, he's basically wrecked everywhere, but he is a short track driver. So if you go to his Wikipedia page and look at his stats from the Xfinity series or the Truck series or whatever, he only was able to race short tracks because he's only 19 years old. And NASCAR has a rule that until you're a certain age, you can only race 1 mile or shorter tracks. So, he kept racing Martinsville, he kept racing Bristol, he kept racing Phoenix, for example. So, and he actually did have some decent finishes there. That's how he got this ride. I mean, he's performed well in those lesser series. Just right now he's not in great equipment, but this probably is a good track for him. He was a bit faster than in practice than, of course, where he qualified, maybe several spots faster. So Greg, it's not out of the question to use Greg Galding. I just wouldn't go, I wouldn't go ham on him or anything like that. I mean, he's still Greg Galding. He starts 37th and is in pretty poor equipment and is wrecked out of like every race this week. So starts 37th. He had a 10 lap average of 31st.
Yeah, it's not quite Trevor Bayne, but once you start giving like serious analysis about Greg Galding, it's getting close to the end of the show. How much exposure, actually, no, I'm not asking exposure questions, but in comparison, like Bowyer, Danica, Menard, and McMurray, can you talk kind of comparatively about those four drivers?
Bowyer, Danica, Menard, and McMurray. Actually, so while we're thinking about it, we talked about teams that might be underperforming. I think Stewart-Haas Racing has been underperforming this week. The only one I feel good about is Clint Bowyer. Harvick, Danica, and Kurt Busch have all struggled. So Bowyer, Danica, McMurray, and who was the other? Menard. So a lot of this is starting position dependent. Danica starts 29th. She does have a good track history here, but she practiced terribly, only the 30th best 10-lap average, 22nd best 10-lap average. So, she's not like terrible here. I think she's usable. I don't have any exposure to her just because I'm going with a tighter core this week. So she's not a terrible play. Clint Bowyer, as we talked about, he starts 8th. So very different situation from Danica. Priced up $2,000 more than her ballpark, and then starts 8th and had a good 10-lap average as well, 9th best and first best single lap average. So, who's likelier to be in the winning lineup? It might be. That's pretty close between the two. I think I like Bowyer more just because I feel more confident in him based off the way he's run this weekend, based off of just, how he's performed in that 10-lap average, for example. So I like Clint Bowyer over Danica, although there certainly is, price considerations and starting position considerations there. Menard, I really like Menard. He starts 22nd. This is a great track for him. I think it's it's either every single time or every single time except one, he's been in what would be like the theoretical optimal lineup if he starts 20th or worse at Martinsville. He practiced 17th best in the 10 lap, 12th in the single lap, starts 22nd. This is a good track for him. And he's also a guy that just doesn't wreck on his own. The last time I think he wrecked on his own was in Phoenix a year ago, and that was a melted bead. I could be wrong, but that's at least the last one I remember. And he just doesn't wreck on his own very much. So he doesn't get in fights. He doesn't lose his temper, which can be a factor at Martinsville. Maybe one of those subjective factors that we talk about. So Martinsville, I think Menard at Martinsville is a good combination there. And the last one's McMurray. I think McMurray should have some exposure to because he could dominate a portion of this race. What's the likelihood? I think pretty low. So I think in terms of probability of being in the winning lineup, Menard has the highest probability of these 4 drivers of being in the winning lineup.
Okay, I really like this next question, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question on it. So 1, what amount of salary are you comfortable leaving on the table today? And then 2, kind of in general, how do you determine for different slates, different tracks, what amount of salary you're comfortable leaving?
I think this week I'm comfortable leaving up to around 1,000. I don't have any lineups that leave 1,000 on the table or more. I think maybe even 48,700, so 1,300 left. I think is plausible given the way qualifying happened this week. I think if you get Logano and Keselowski dominating or whatever, then you don't necessarily need Jimmy Johnson as your place differential guy. You could go with 4 other place differential guys, and that will leave you maybe $1,000 under the cap. I think that's certainly a plausible lineup. I think my most I have is 800 or 900, maybe 700, 800, 900 in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then what was the second part?
And then in general, kind of going across courses, tracks. My mind's on PGA. Going across tracks and then across slates. How do you determine the amount that you're comfortable leaving for any given slate?
Yeah. So the way I go about that is just starting to make lineups and see what makes sense. What can be in the winning lineup? Obviously, with restrictor plates, it's place differential. And so the drivers starting in the back are going to be the best drivers regardless of price in general. So throw out the restrictor plates. The rest of them, how do I go about determining that? Well, most of the time you want to use a good chunk of your salary, but it's NASCAR. You don't have to in general. The way I look at it is when is their value? Last week, Jimmy Johnson and Joey Logano qualified in the back. That was a just massive chunk of your salary right there with 2 guys you're jamming into most of your lineups. So you're in general using a good chunk of your salary cap. But what could you have gotten away with? Well, you could have maybe reasonably faded Johnson, played Bain and Logano, and then gone with some other drivers that could have dominated the race. Kyle Larson obviously being one of those who wasn't priced up in the super elite tier yet. So it's so week to week, track dependent. The way I just determine is I just start making lineups and figuring out what is the cheapest thing that makes sense. And I think this week it's about $1,000 left on the table, give or take a couple hundred.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this person is making only one lineup. I'm assuming it's for cash. Johnson and McMurray versus Keselowski and Kenseth.
I'm going to go with Keselowski and Kenseth. I think the deal breaker there for me is Keselowski versus McMurray. I think, both are fine, but I think Keselowski has a higher chance to dominate if you're making one lineup for cash. That said, I don't love either of those combinations for cash.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've talked about Jimmy Johnson, you've talked about David Reagan, talked about Austin Dillon, Hamlin versus Logano in GPPs.
Logano.
Yeah.
Second most likely driver to dominate.
Yeah, Stenhouse versus Menard.
That's a really good one. I have more Stenhouse than Menard. I think that's for me a theory play. I think they're really, really neck and neck. Whatever your gut tells you, man, that's basically 50-50.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about Ryan Blaney? He's starting 7th.
I'm not using him. Too far forward for me in a track he's not likely to dominate at. He didn't have terrible practice times. But I can't use Blaney at Martinsville if he's not going to dominate and he's going to start 7th and is probably going to not finish 7th. That said, Blaney is he's not a terrible driver by any means. I mean, he's good at these short tracks. But he's 7,700. I'd rather play some other drivers in the 7,000 range that have much more place differential potential.
Okay, Truex or Keselowski?
Damn, that's close. I'm gonna go slight nod to Keselowski. I think both are good plays. I think they're probably my third and fourth most likely dominators. But I'm gonna give this excuse me. I'm gonna give a slight nod to Keselowski based off track history.
Okay. When is projected ownership going to be released as part of the model?
Probably after Easter. Probably after the Easter break. So we got this week, we got next week at Texas, and then I think the weekend right after that is the Easter break. Hope to have it ready for Bristol.
Menard or Almirola?
Also a very good. We haven't talked much about Almirola. I think other than the fact that I like him. Again, this is a theory play for me. I think Menard's more likely, but I'm going with Almirola for a little bit of leverage. That 10-lap average for him, his strong track history here, relative to what we normally get from Almirola, both of them are neck and neck in terms of track history. And Almirola's priced higher. He's starting further forward, so he's going to be lower owned than Menard, I think. So I'm going to go with Almirola on the theory play.
Mm-hmm. McMurray or Allmendinger?
Allmendinger, easy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and this next question, we talked about it on the podcast that we did Friday night, but let's talk about it here because we haven't mentioned it on the live show. For cash games, how many dominators do we need this week?
Cash games, how many dominators? We need at least one guy to dominate a portion of the race in our cash game lineups. So that said, how many shots are we taking at dominators? Depends on how you want to approach this. I feel pretty confident in my picks this week for my dominator, so I'm only taking 2 shots. If you feel less confident, I think it's certainly plausible to take 3 shots. I even considered a 4-attempt lineup. I considered a lineup with McMurray, Larson, because Larson starts in the pole. McMurray had the second best 10-lap average. And then starts 6th. So I think there's definitely a chance McMurray could dominate a portion of this. And then I think it was Logano and Kyle Busch, like those 4 being like, I think I can get 75% of the dominator points just from those 4 drivers. I considered it. I'm not doing it. But, you need at least one, depending on how much of that race that one dominates, possibly 2. I'm taking 2 shots at it this week.
Okay. This is the final question it looks like we have. The model likes Truex and Harvick more than Logano, Jimmy, and McMurray. Why?
The model likes Truex and Harvick more than Logano. Who else?
Jimmy and McMurray.
Yeah, so, like I said, the model makes small adjustments. It doesn't take huge swings at overfitting. It obviously is mostly just dominator points right there. It's going to give Harvick a higher probability of dominating than McMurray because on average, if we ran this race 100 times, that's probably what would happen. Even though Harvick's car is junk, the model doesn't know that Harvick's car is junk. It knows he practiced pretty slow, but that's only a small portion of the model. There's also track history. There's the fact there's a lot of randomness in this race. The model just like it Harvick has performed better this year than McMurray in terms of driver rating, not in terms, obviously, of finishing position, because that's why Harvick's starting further back than McMurray. But in terms of driver rating, Harvick's a stronger driver. So the model knows that, in general, Harvick is the better driver and has made a small adjustment for the practice times and said, okay, McMurray does have some chance to lead some laps, but it's much more likely in 100 times we run this race, Harvick leads more laps. What we intuitively know, and this is the subjective stuff, is McMurray has a really strong car and Harvick's car is junk based off of what we've seen on Twitter, what we've seen in practice, just with our eyes and our intuition. So that's where the model gets 50% of it wrong, especially at a track like Martinsville, which is much harder to predict. And that's why, we don't strictly go by the model. We use it as a nice tool to help us inform us, maybe as like a starting spot for where we should go from there.
Mm-hmm. All right, one more question that came in. Logano or Larson in GPPs?
Logano. I think Larson's going to be too highly owned relative to the probability he finishes in the winning lineup. He does start on the pole. He's going to lead the first set of laps. There's no question about that. But at Martinsville, where every lap, there's 500 laps, you really need those dominators, and then finding value from there. Is it impossible Larson's in the winning lineup? No. I mean, it could be a lineup where maybe it's Larson, Kyle Busch and Martin Truex Jr., 3 guys dominate the race at different portions. That could be a winning lineup, certainly. So I have a couple 3 dominator lineups, but I mostly have 2 dominator lineups.
Okay. Final question here. You gave us a winning driver in the podcast, but I cannot remember who that was.
Yeah.
Who is but after practice now, who's your winning driver?
Yeah, so it was Denny Hamlin I gave after practice. I'm gonna nix that. I think it's gonna come down to honestly, I think it's gonna come down to McMurray, Logano, and Kyle Busch. It's gonna be one of those 3, and those were the 3 best in the 10-lap average. They seem to have the 3 best cars over the long run as well, even longer than 10 laps if you if you have that information. So I think it's going to be one of those 3. God, it's tough because Kyle Busch and Joey Logano had that beef from earlier at Las Vegas, and that beef was kind of makes me wonder if there'll be any payback this week at that tiny track of Martinsville. So it's kind of an interesting situation. I guess you could play an angle there where there's some payback and you go underweight on Logano or something. But I think it's going to be Joey Logano. My pick is Joey Logano. It could be Kyle Busch. Those are my 2 favorites.
All right. Any closing thoughts here?
Closing thoughts? No, I think we're good. This is, I feel pretty confident about this week. I have a much tighter core than normal, so it's either going to be a boom or bust week for me. But that's usually how it is for me. I try to go big or go home.
Yeah. All right. That's going to do it for this NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter at Rotodoc, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.